So what we want to do this time is we want to modify this function, insert reservation, to return not just the error, but also the ID of the newly inserted record. And I've already added the returning ID SQL necessary into the query. So the first thing I'll do is modify this to say it returns not just an error, but an int and an error. And then I'll make this return 0, because if there's an error, we don't really care what the ID is. But here I'll return a variable called new ID, which doesn't exist. So let's go declare it. New ID, var new ID is an int. So that creates it. Now I want to actually change it from an exec, which does an insert. I'm going to change this to a query. And I'm going to change it to a query because actually what we're doing is returning something from our SQL. So it's an insert statement, but it's also a query. So the method that does that returns only an error, and it's not called exec context, it's called query row context. And the only thing I have to do is, because I'm actually doing a query row, is I now have available the scan function. And I'll scan the one thing being returned, which is the ID, into my variable new ID. And that's all I have to do here. Now, I obviously, because I've changed the syntax of this function in Postgres.go, I'll copy the whole thing, go back to my repository, and replace the old version with the new version. Perfect. So that means my handler is going to change too. So here, I'm no longer getting one value back. I'm actually getting new reservation ID and an error, potentially an error. So I'm not using that yet, but I will in a moment. So what I'm going to do with this is I'm going to use this new reservation ID along with all the other required information to build up a room restriction model and send that to a function I'll create in a moment, which I'll probably call insert room restriction. So let's build up the model first. We can build the model just by saying restriction, I'll call it restriction, is going to be assigned the value of models.roomRestriction. And I'm going to use a feature built into this IDE called fill all fields, which just saves me some typing. I don't need the ID of the restriction I'm inserting. I don't know what it is. I don't care what it is. I just want to insert something. I do have a start date, and I have a start date in my variable called start date. And I do have the end date in a variable called end date. And the room ID, I have that too, room ID. And reservation ID, I now have, because it's the new reservation ID. New reservation ID, new reservation ID. Oh, I got to make this an assign. That's why it's an error. I have new reservation ID, so I'll put that in here. The restriction ID, I will make 1. And I'll have to fill out my database field before I can actually use that. I don't have any restriction IDs yet. So I'll just populate that and make that a reservation, restriction ID of type reservation. Created that and updated that, I'll let that be taken care of at the database level. And I don't need these 3 because these are just things I might use in the future, but they're not actually part of the database field. So I now have this restriction. So let's go over to our Postgres and create a new function called func, and it has to be on the receiver have a receiver of m Postgres. And I'll call it insert room restriction. It will take one argument, which I'll call r, and it's of type models room restriction, and all it's going to return is an error, or nil if there's no error. And I'll just say return nil, just so I can get this up and running. Then, because I've created this, I actually have to close that. Because I've created this, I need to, hopefully, if I can stop clicking the wrong buttons, copy this whole thing, fix that so it says Postgres DB repo, copy this whole thing, and put it in my repository. Okay. And now we go back to our handlers, and we can actually call that method on our database repository. And it's just as simple as error is assigned the value of m.db.insert room restriction, and pass it our restriction. And if there's an error, paste it in here. And you may notice that I accidentally left out the return function in my error check. And I added that before I started this lecture. So I added it here, and I added it here, and I added it here. And if I didn't do that, things would still work, but it wouldn't stop execution at this point. And I do want things to stop at this point. I don't want it to say, you can't parse the date and try to do everything else, because it'll just fail when it gets down to the database insert part. So just add a return as I did in those three places. Anyway, I have now created my function, which doesn't do anything yet. We'll have to add that. And I've called my function. But before I forget, let's go back over to our database and find our bookings database and find the restrictions and add one restriction. And a restriction of type 1, which is what will be added in for us, will be a restriction of type reservation. And I got to put some dates in there, so I'll put in a date and a date. Okay, and save that. There, I have one in there now. So let's go back and finish up our actual routine to insert this restriction. So this is going to be a statement, but first of all, let's copy and paste this context stuff so I don't have to retype it all. Paste it in here, and let's write our statement. Statement is assign the value of. Insert into our database table name is room restrictions. And what do we want to insert in there? Let's go look at our structure again. It's going to be start date, end date, room ID. Start date, end date, room ID, which is the lowercase I. Reservation ID, created at, updated at, restriction ID. Reservation ID. And then we'll go tab over. Created at, updated at, and restriction ID. So I have all this information passed to us in the variable called R. So we're going to execute that query, and we're going to get a result that I don't care about, potentially an error that I do care about, and we'll call our database function m.db.execContext. The first parameter is the context that I create at the top of the function. The second parameter is my query, which is a statement, and then all of the arguments. And I'll put, again, all of those on their own line just so they're easier to read. So I left something out of my query here. I'm glad that I noticed that. We insert that, and then we have to close the parentheses, and on another line say values, and the values are $1. And how many are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. $2, $3, $4, $5, $6, $7. And the parentheses are closed. That looks better. So we want R dot, and what's the first thing? Start date. And then R dot, end date. And then R dot, room ID. And then R dot, reservation ID. And then R dot, created at? No. Time dot now for created at. Time dot now for updated at. And finally, R dot, restriction ID. And a closing comma. And that should do it. We got to check for our error though. If error is not equal to nil, just return the error. Okay, so let's make sure that we have this, all of this is in our repository. It is. There are no errors being displayed on our Postgres. There are not. There is no comment. Let's add one. Inserts a room restriction into the database. Okay. All looks good. Yes. Okay, and let's check our handlers. We have that. We have a value for restriction ID in the database. Perfect. Let's stop our stop our application and start it up again. Okay, it's not running, so let's run it. It's running. Let's go back to our web browser. I'll refresh the page to make sure that I have a valid CSRF token and put some values in here. John Doe. Start date 2020 0201 to 2020. Oh, that's in the past. Don't want to do that. 2021 0201 to 2021 0204. Email is john@doe.com, and his phone number is 567-678-0000. 0987. Okay, let's hope that works. And it did. Now let's go look at our database, which is right here because I'm using Postico. There should be another reservation. Oh, that's our reservation. That's our reservations restrictions. Those are fine. There should now be, hey, look at that. I have two because I did this and before this lecture started and forgot to delete it. Sorry. So ignore that one. But I do have this one, which is the one that I just added. Perfect. And let's look under room restrictions. And we have the room restriction entered. And it's from 201 to 204. Room ID 1, reservation ID is 3, and the restriction ID is 1. And that's perfect. So now we have a means of inserting not just a reservation, but also the restrictions for that room for the dates of the reservation we just saved. So we're making some progress. We'll move on in the next lecture and do some more work with the database.